Good morning, everyone. The Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands will now come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on 14 National Park Service bills. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. In addition, due to the broad interest in today's hearing, I would like to ask unanimous consent that all interested members be allowed to join us and participate on the dais. Thank you all for attending the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands legislative hearing on 14 public lands bills, including many that recognize and honor African American, Native American, and women's history. I would like to extend my gratitude to the bill sponsors joining us today to testify and to the witnesses, many of whom have traveled to our nation's capital to speak to the personal and national significance of these proposals. Many of the bills before us today seek to ensure that our public lands represent the diversity of the American experience. Federal protections for these sites would honor the contributions, hardships, and history of millions of Americans across time and place. As we look ahead to Memorial Day, these bills present an opportunity to commemorate fallen heroes from the battlefields of the American Revolution, War of 1812, and the Civil War. They also memorialize the injustices of our past, such as the bitter legacies of federal Indian removal and the neglect of African American burial grounds. These bills elevate the history of the steelworkers, aviation entrepreneurs, tribal leaders, homesteaders, colonists, suffragettes, and many more who have helped shape the nation. It is especially fitting that we consider a suffrage memorial today because yesterday marked the 100th anniversary of this chamber's passage of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. And this August is the 99th anniversary of the ratification of that constitutional amendment. We will also continue the important conversation work of this committee by reviewing bills that protect the natural history of our country's national scenic trails and our unique coastal ecosystems from Maine to California. The subcommittee now has the opportunity to advance legislation that elevates the causes, principles, and voices of Americans that reflect the diverse history of America herself. I would like to thank the sponsoring members and witnesses again for being here today. I look forward to your testimony, and I now recognize Ranking Member Heiser for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate you calling this hearing. I look forward to hearing about the various bills that will be discussed. I want to personally thank our colleagues for being here today. It's an honor to see you, and thank you for your leadership in these various bills. And for the other panelists who will come a little bit later on, we welcome you and glad you're here. Don Young is the ranking member of this committee, and he is not here now, so I'm sure we can have his opening remarks added to the record, or perhaps he'll want to say something when he gets here. But again, thank you for this hearing. I look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Ranking Member Heiser. Now I would like to turn to our first panel and welcome the members of Congress who wish to testify on the bills they have sponsored. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but you may submit a longer statement for the record if you choose. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left, and then red when time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm very excited that you are having this hearing and taking up these initiatives. My bill, H.R. 2525, is the Steel Valley National Heritage Act of 2019. It includes Mahoning, Trumbull counties in Ohio, eastern Ohio, and Mercer and Lawrence counties in western Pennsylvania. It designates these the National Valley, Steel Valley National Heritage Area, encouraging community-based historic preservation, natural resource conservation, cultural interpretation, heritage tourism, and recreation. Northeast Ohio and western Pennsylvania have a rich steel history. For decades, this region was one of the 5 largest steelmaking areas in the world. Its mills played a fundamental role in the development of our nation. raising great American cities, building iconic infrastructure, and supplying multiple war efforts. At a time when society was fraught with division, steelmaking created racially, ethnically, and culturally diverse communities forged by a common identity. Steelworkers powered the labor movement, grew the middle class, and were the economic and cultural lifeblood of the industrial Midwest. The Steel Valley National Heritage Area would honor this legacy by integrating and promoting steel-related heritage sites, cultural initiatives, and recreational opportunities within this region. The bill establishes a commission of Ohioans and Pennsylvanians with knowledge of historic preservation, conservation, economic development, and tourism, organized labor, and the arts. This is a great story of Americana, and we had so many people in our community for so many years be a part of the great industrial middle class in America. And I would just say why this is important, and I think this bill is important, Madam Chair, is that we are in the process of reinventing ourselves. Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Akron, Youngstown, the old steel towns, the old mill towns in the heartland. And as we begin to move into the newer technologies, as we move into 3D printing and additive manufacturing, as we move into some of the other technologies around driverless cars and driverless trucks and the internet and social media and electric vehicles and wind and solar, all of these new technologies, it's critically important for us to also remember where we came from, but also have the opportunity to increase the quality of life. And these designations really help us designate our history, but it's also a quality of life matter. And it allows us to have investments into these communities. These designations are critical around travel tourism, giving a sense of place for our young people to come back. So you can have all the new jobs you want in the world, but if you don't have the quality of life and the sense of place, young people are not going to want to come back to these communities. So this is not just a historic issue. This is a critical component to our economic development in our area. So I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be here, and I hope and encourage the committee to act on the Steel Valley National Heritage Act of 2019. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ryan. The chair now recognizes the gentle lady from Maine, Ms. Pingree.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's wonderful to see you sitting in that chair, and to Ranking Member Young, who's not here, but Mr. Heiser, who's taking on the role, and all the other members of the subcommittee. I appreciate you allowing me to testify today in support of my bill, H.R. 1248, the York River Wild and Scenic Designation Act. I also want to welcome a fellow Mainer who's here today, Charles, we call him Chuck Ott. You'll hear from him later after the members of Congress have all finished our pontificating on our important bills. Chuck's the chair of the York River Study Committee. I want to thank him and Paul Dest, who's the executive director of the Wells Reserve, and Jennifer Hunter, the York River Study Coordinator, as well as so many other Mainers who have worked tirelessly on this effort. This legislation is the result of a decade of advocacy by constituents who live and work in the 4 towns in the Watershed area, York, Elliott, Kittery, and South Berwick, who all care deeply about the York River. The Friends of the York River began the efforts leading towards designation as far back as 2008, and 6 years ago I introduced legislation to fund a study of the York River. 5 years ago, the House passed my bill to fund a study of the York River, and the York River Study Committee determined the river was eligible to be in the Partnership River program. The 4 watershed communities then held votes or town council endorsements in the fall to show their support of the designation. So now we're here today after years of work, asking for the designation to actually take place. I've heard from dozens of small business owners, community groups, elected officials from our state and local level, members of our fishing community, our sportsmen, and conservationists. It's quite heartening to hear from such a diverse range of stakeholders who all agree that this designation will universally benefit them. Since all of you may not have had the pleasure of visiting the York River, I want to tell you what makes it so special. Its salt marshes serve as a nursery ground for nearly 30 species of fish that are vital to the Gulf of Maine ecosystem. It has historic significance. As the site of our Native American tribes in Maine for hundreds, likely thousands of years, and to some of the first English settlers who came from the 1600s. And now it's a working waterfront for farmers, shellfish harvesters, and fishermen. My bill is the final step in a destination process that will protect this river for generations of Mainers to come and to ensure that this working waterfront remains vibrant. As rivers like York are affected by sea level rise, extreme weather events, and other drastic changes, a wild and scenic designation will allow us to monitor these changes and share data with federal stewards of similar water bodies. The National System of Wild and Scenic Rivers protects over 13,000 miles of rivers in the United States, but as it stands, only one of them is Maine. We are very eager to double that number with today's bill and bring the York River into the program. I want to thank my colleagues in the Maine delegation, especially Congressman Jared Golden, who, although new to Congress, was an early supporter of this bill. I want to thank the chair for this hearing today, thank Mr. Young, who we are always happy to welcome in Maine and would be happy to have him come visit the York River. And I look forward to this hearing and urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this bill as it moves forward. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pingree. Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member. I would just like to initially thank the chair and the ranking member for their help last week in moving forward an important piece of legislation in terms of civil rights, as well as important to our region. Again, thank you for doing that. And I come before you today with another piece of legislation important to our region. H.R. 182, a bill to reauthorize the Cape Cod National Seashore Advisory Commission. Last year, this passed the House in the days of, the last days of the Congress unanimously. Went to the Senate where there were some, I think, issues that came up that really are not going to be obstacles going forward. But I do thank this committee and the members last year for bringing it forward. The Cape Cod National Seashore Advisory Commission was established by President Kennedy in 1961 when he signed the act that founded the Cape Cod National Seashore, a bill which he himself had previously offered when he was a senator from Massachusetts. The Cape Cod National Seashore Advisory Commission was the first advisory commission created within the National Park Service, as at the time it was recognized that the unique geographic, economic, and social conditions of the outer Cape region meant that there was a special need for host communities to have a robust dialogue with the park and park services. Since that time, the Seashore Advisory Commission has played a critical role in helping the National Seashore and its host communities to share a productive dialogue, helping to solve problems and avoid conflicts between the communities and the seashore. It represents, in my opinion, the very best of how local communities can work cooperatively with a federal agency. The Cape Cod National Seashore Advisory Commission has been reauthorized routinely by Congress over the last 60 years. And as I mentioned at the beginning, last year this committee in the House passed H.R. 5585, my bill to reauthorize the commission for the 115th Congress, and they did it unanimously. Today we can advance this common sense legislation that provides thousands in my community with a forum to address their concerns with the National Seashore. Providing testimony about this important and the successful commission from Cape Cod is one of the most well-respected constituents that I have, Richard Delaney of the Center for Coastal Studies. Mr. Delaney is not only one of the most prominent coastal and Atlantic right whale researchers in the world, but also works on a wide range of issues important to my district, not the least among them as chairman of the Cape Cod National Seashore Advisory Commission. I want to thank the chairs for bringing this important bill to this hearing in a timely fashion. And while it is important to our region, certainly this commission is incredibly important to all the constituents that I have, and in fact, just the countless Americans every year that come to this national treasure. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and I appreciate your efforts at bringing this forward. Thank you for being good stewards of our national treasures, and thank you, I hope, for advancing this legislation expeditiously. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. I would like to say that if any members, I realize your busy schedules, if you need to leave to move on to your next meeting, you are more than welcome to go. And I thank you so much for being here. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Young. Appreciate the opportunity to be before the subcommittee today to hear H.R. 1472 and to rename the Homestead National Monument of America located in Beatrice, Nebraska as the Homestead National Historical Park. This legislation is co-sponsored by both of my Nebraska colleagues, Don Bacon and Jeff Fortenberry, although Mr. Fortenberry is here for another reason, but he's welcome to chair on this proposal as well. This effort has received 15 letters of support from local stakeholders as well. The Homestead Act of 1862, signed into law by President Lincoln, helped shape the American West. It allowed U.S. citizens to earn ownership of a portion of the vast public lands owned by the federal government across the western United States. Ultimately, the federal government granted titles to 10% of the land in the U.S. through the program. It also gave millions the chance to make a new life for themselves, their families, and future generations. In order to claim a 160-acre parcel of land under the Homestead Act, a homesteader was required to be at least 21 years old or the head of a household, build a home on the land, improve and farm the land for 5 years, and pay an $18 filing fee. The Homestead Act remained in place through 1976 with provisions allowing for homesteading in Alaska through 1986. In the 3rd District of Nebraska, we are very proud the very first claim under the Homestead Act was made by a man named Daniel Freeman near Beatrice, Nebraska. To memorialize this milestone, as well as the 1.6 million other claims which built the American West, the Homestead National Monument of America was established. The problem with referring to this site as a monument is that it is not a single static monument like a statue or obelisk or even a natural feature like Scottsbluff National Monument at my hometown of Gering, Nebraska, but an extensive park celebrating these pioneers. Homestead National Monument consists of a heritage museum, the historic Freeman School, a tall grass prairie, hiking trails, a forest, various farming demonstrations, and much more. Referring to this site as an historical park instead of a monument would far more clearly describe the opportunities to take in this living history site. In fact, according to the Friends of Homestead National Monument of America, 89% of first-time visitors to the facility were actually confused by the name. Recently, the number of National Park Services facilities such as the Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve, the Gateway Arch National Park, and Pinnacles National Park have received new names which more accurately reflect the purpose and content of the facilities to address similar concerns. On behalf of the people of Nebraska, and particularly the citizens of Beatrice and Gage County, Nebraska, I appreciate the opportunity to advocate in support of this proposal today. We have opportunity to ensure all Americans understand the opportunities available to them in South Central Nebraska, and I appreciate your interest. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Chair Holland and Ranking Member Young, for inviting me today. And before I begin with my own testimony, I'd like to second what Congressman Smith said. Before redistricting, I used to represent this area, and this has been an active movement on behalf of the people of Beatrice, Gage County, and frankly, the entire state, to rename this important monument to a national parks, which would eliminate confusion. It's very important to us, and it's a very important part of our nation's remembrance effort to celebrate the great settlements of the expanse of the West. Thank you very much. Thank you, Congressman Smith. I'm here today to talk to you, Madam Chair, about Chief Standing Bear, Ponca leader, one of America's most important civil rights leaders. Before I do that, let me recognize our colleague in the state of Nebraska, Ms. Judy Goshkabosh, who will give testimony later. She chairs the Nebraska Indian Commission in Nebraska, back home. Nobute wi ugate eo kigoshi. These were the beginning words of Chief Standing Bear as he stood on trial in Omaha in 1879. And what was he accused of? He was accused of bringing his dead son home to be buried on their native land. The Ponca tribe was forcefully removed from the Niobrara area of Nebraska, relocated to Oklahoma. It was a trail of hardship. Chief Standing Bear's little daughter died along the way, and his son became gravely ill. Before his son died, Chief Standing Bear made him a promise that I will bring you home to be buried. And so he was arrested for leaving the reservation. This resulted in a court hearing, a court case, prosecution. Chief Standing Bear went on to say this: "Our hands are not the same color. If I pierce mine, I will feel pain. If you pierce your hand, you will feel pain. When the blood flows, it will be the same color. No buthin, wakodaak aiki go waksa. I am a man. God made us the same." And with those words, the Ponca leader, Chief Standing Bear, allowed Native Americans to make their case as a whole and deeply, deeply moved the proceedings. He expressed the inherent dignity and rights of all people, regardless of color or ethnicity. He was so convincing that U.S. District Court Judge Elmer Dundy, in an unprecedented move, ruled, quote, Madam Chair, and this is 1879, quote, "An Indian is a person within the meaning of habeas corpus." Not till 1879. Standing Bear had won his right and the right of all Native Americans to be recognized as persons under the law. That such a glaring injustice could exist is almost unimaginable to us today. And yet the Ponca chief prevailed in one of the most important civil rights cases in the history of our nation. So in Congress, Madam Chair, we continue to recognize Standing Bear's remarkable life and achievement on behalf of his people, and in fact, a statue of him will be placed in Statuary Hall shortly, as the state legislature has decided to commemorate his life there. And so I have reintroduced a bill which has passed the House previously, H.R. 2490, that directs the Secretary of the Interior to conduct a feasibility for the Chief Standing Bear National Historic Trail. This is only appropriate given Chief Standing Bear will be representing us again here in the United States Capitol. Madam Chair, with the enshrinement of this trail into law, we will set a marker for remembrance of this great civil rights leader, a reminder of the need for the protection of human dignity, and a celebration of the possibilities brought about by one man's courage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fortenberry, and for that history lesson. It's a proud legacy that all Nebraskans can own, actually. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Ranking Member Young, and members of the committee. Thank you so much for holding this hearing and allowing us to testify, and for me to highlight my bill, H.R. 1727, the Complete America Great Trails Act. Established in 1968 under the National Trail System, National Scenic Trails are trails of significant length, often thousands of miles, that pass through areas of particular natural beauty all across the United States. From Yellowstone to the Everglades, these trails connect America's greatest places, crossing dozens of states and more than 100 congressional districts. Unfortunately, of these 11 congressionally designated trails, only the Appalachian Trail is completed, while the Pacific Crest Trail, Continental Divide Trail, and the Potomac Heritage Trail each have a number of missing links. Additionally, these trails are threatened by encroachment from development. To close the gaps in these great trails and protect them from development, the Complete America's Great Trails Act will provide private property owners with voluntary tax incentives to dedicate public access and conservation easements along these scenic trail corridors. The value of this tax credit would be the fair market value of any National Scenic Trail conservation contribution. When the Appalachian Trail was established by statute in 1968, it followed remote ridgelines from Maine to Georgia. Today, though the trail is complete, much of the land surrounding it is under tremendous and growing developmental pressure. Two other National Scenic Trails, the Continental Divide Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail, traverse some of the wildest and most scenic country in America. From the Sierra Nevada to Glacier National Park, these trails cross terrain of unrivaled ruggedness and solitude. And just outside our nation's capital, the Potomac Heritage National Scenic Trail, which runs through my district, is designed to connect George Washington's birthplace at Pope's Creek with his plantation at Mount Vernon and with historic sites incorporated like Harper's Ferry. Other National Scenic Trails may be less well-known, but are no less spectacular, and include the Florida National Scenic Trail, the Ice Age National Scenic Trail, North County National Scenic Trail, among others, and they traverse places as varied as Wisconsin's moraine and Florida's vast Everglades. The Complete America's Great Trails Act will help protect and complete these national treasures. Completing our National Scenic Trails is not just an issue of conservation and recreation. It's also good economics. According to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, outdoor recreation is responsible for 6.5 million jobs and contributes through the entire panoply of outdoor recreation, $730 billion to the national economy. It also estimates 50 to 70 million Americans will visit these trails each year. These visitors pay for gas, food, lodging in towns and cities close to the trails, providing a boost to local and often rural economies. By completing these trails, we can help communities all across America to reach their full economic potential. As the former chairman of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, I understand fully how beneficial trails can be to a community. Trails increase the value of property. They make communities more attractive places in which to live. Trails provide transportation options. Finally, trails can even reduce medical costs by encouraging exercise and a healthy lifestyle. The Complete America's Great Trails Act is endorsed by a variety of organizations, including the Trust for Public Lands and the American Hiking Society. I would ask that 21 letters of endorsement from 21 different organizations be entered into the record at this time.
Without,
I thank the chair.
without objection.
Congress has a responsibility to play a role in protecting all public lands for future generations, especially these beautiful scenic trails. We've already done important bipartisan work in reauthorizing the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and we can do it again. This bill offers both sides of the aisle another opportunity to promote conservation and protect our natural treasures for generations to come. I thank the chairman and ranking member and my good friend Mr. Heiss, who's here today, for their consideration and for including this important bill in your package. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Young?
I appreciate my friend from Virginia. I do have some concerns. It's major implications, the tax code, and we don't have any witnesses on that side. I'm not going to ask you any questions. I just wanted to understand that the Senate is currently investigating the conservation easement deduction, and this credit would risk replicating and even increasing issues surrounding inflated appraisals. I would suggest respectfully, Madam Chairman, that before we proceed with this legislation, that we find out what that report's going to say, because some of these easements have been misused. And when that happens, it deletes the purpose of the whole system. I happen to support the system, but if there's people taking advantages of it, I think we ought to look at that and see if we can correct it, so it doesn't happen again, and it is actually a trail that's not being reutilized for other additional, including high-rises. So I just wanted you to know that's occurring right now, and Ways and Means was going to look at this legislation. Maybe they can come up with an answer to it.
Madam Chairman, if I may respond, I thank my friend from Alaska, and I know of his commitment to protecting the beauty of public lands. We'll be glad to work with you and your staff to try to address those concerns and make sure that they are mitigated. I would just end on this note that I have direct experience in trying to complete trails. We had something called the Cross County Trail in my county. It's 41 miles in length, right across the river. Everyone thought we couldn't do it, but through these mechanisms, we were able to complete it, and we were able to avoid anyone abusing it. So I know it can be done. That trail is now completed, and I was honored that they actually named it after me while I was still alive. But I know it can be done, and I promise to work with you, Mr. Young, to make sure it's done correctly. And I thank you for your caution.
I appreciate that, and I think if you check the legislation of the trails, it was passed under my watch. So I know the interest. I just don't want people to take advantage of a pretty good system and hurt it in the long run. And I thank the lady.
Thank you, Mr. Young. And thank you very much, Mr. Connolly, for testifying. Yes, you are welcome to leave after your testimony, recognizing how busy the members are. So please know that. The chair now recognizes the gentle lady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Chairwoman Holland and Ranking Member Young, for the opportunity to be before the committee today. This February, I introduced the African American Burial Grounds Network Act with my colleagues, Representative Donald McEachin and Ted Budd, because it's crucially important that historic African American burial grounds be documented and preserved. African American burial grounds are an important part of the history of the United States that too frequently have been overlooked or neglected. Between 1619 and 1865, millions of African Americans were enslaved throughout the United States. Through slavery, enslaved individuals' burial sites were often confined to remote areas or marginal property that were rarely documented. After the Civil War, Jim Crow laws segregated burial sites by race. Additionally, burial grounds for African Americans often didn't receive the type of maintenance and record keeping that white burial grounds enjoyed. And that's why today many of these historic burial grounds and cemeteries are in a state of disrepair and in need of preservation or are unmarked. And without adequate records of these burial sites, they are frequently discovered inadvertently during new construction, slowing or halting projects, while creating distress for family members and descendants. Even in communities that know of and care deeply about their local African American cemeteries, there's frequently insufficient funding for surveying, preservation, and maintenance. And to help address these problems, I introduced the African American Burial Grounds Network Act, which will ensure that communities can preserve their local history while better informing development decisions and community planning. It will create a voluntary national network of historic African American burial grounds run through the National Park Service. It will provide technical assistance and grants to local organizations to research, to identify, and preserve burial grounds in the network. And it will support the creation of educational materials for community members, local groups, and schools about African American burial grounds. This would be a voluntary network requiring a request from an individual landowner, private or non-profit organization, a state or local government for a site to be considered for the network. The National Park Service would then evaluate the sites submitted to it to determine if they qualify for the network. Thankfully, many scholars and communities are already leading the way by creating databases to track the location of these sites to better preserve them and prevent their destruction. However, we must ensure that there's coordination between the national, state, and local efforts to restore and protect these sites for future generations. Additionally, to ensure the protection of burial sites that might be at risk for looting or other harm, H.R. 1179 includes safeguards for sensitive information in keeping with guidelines established in the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. The need for this network is urgent. In my district and throughout the country, there are issues of burial grounds being located too late by construction or in dire need of preservation. All around the country, long-hidden grave sites of African Americans have been uncovered in recent years in a small park in New York City, on a plantation in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, on a college campus in Georgia, under a playground in Philadelphia, but behind an apartment complex in North Carolina, and the list goes on. In my district, there are countless instances of rediscovered sites or sites in need of care. The Middleville Cemetery in Charlotte is 145 years old. It's a cemetery for freed blacks with burials dating back from 1886 to 1982. It's a cemetery without a single sign or marker until a couple of years ago. I went out there last Saturday with 70 volunteers to learn how to detect unmarked grave sites and to preserve headstones. I have a couple of slides that you have. In the first one, it shows a small number of burial sites and markers on the property, just over a dozen. But a team of experts used ground-penetrating radar to show us what really lie under the ground that we were standing on. There was more than 300 burials are at that site. Additionally, there have been a number of incidents in Mecklenburg County, countless incidents nationwide where construction has inadvertently disturbed burial grounds. So by creating a voluntary database of burial sites and providing funding for identification of those sites, we can avoid more of these tragic incidents from occurring ahead of time. That's better for companies looking to build, and it's better for a community as well. This bill is urgent because each day, more and more African-American burial grounds are damaged or destroyed. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to mark up this bill, this important bipartisan bill, and send it to the House floor for a vote. One of the best things we can do in life is to ensure that we preserve and respect the memory of our ancestors. As Maya Angelou said, the more you know of your history, the more liberated you are. Madam Chair, thank you very much for the time and consideration to speak before the committee.
Thank you very much, Ms. Adams. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you very much, Chair Holland and Ranking Member Young, other members of the committee, for having this hearing today and inviting us to testify. I'm here in support of the Chesapeake Bay Gateways and Water Trails Reauthorization Act of 2019, which would reauthorize the Chesapeake Bay Gateways program for 6 years. This is administered by the National Park Service, and the program provides financial and technical assistance to local communities to increase interpretation, recreation, education, and access to the Chesapeake Bay, a national treasure and economic driver. In other words, we have all these people who live, in a sense, within arm's length of the bay. Making sure that they can get access to the opportunity to experience it is critical, and that's what the Gateways program does. It has provided to date over $20 million in technical and financial assistance for more than 300 projects in communities throughout the watershed, stimulating the region's outdoor recreation economy. It's also a very important part of the Chesapeake Bay restoration effort, helping the National Park Service fulfill its responsibility to foster land conservation, public access, stewardship, diversity, and education, as outlined in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. I'd note that this morning there was some data that came back which showed that despite heavy rains, a lot of runoff that occurred last year from the watershed into the bay is demonstrating its resilience, which is the product of many, many years of many constituencies working together to improve the health of the bay. The program was originally authorized in 1998. It has recently relied on 1 to 2 year reauthorizations because we haven't been able to give the program the certainty that it deserves and that stakeholders are looking for. The current authorization is set to expire in October of this year, making it critical that Congress move quickly to reauthorize this program so that the National Park Service can continue to fulfill its responsibilities to the Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is home to over 18 million people. There are 18 million people that live within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, 6 states and the District of Columbia, 10 million of which live along or very near the shoreline, and thousands of species of plants and animals. As the largest estuary in the nation, the Chesapeake Bay watershed extends from Virginia through my home state of Maryland out to West Virginia and up to New York. The Gateways program has helped to connect diverse groups of people from near and far to this amazing natural resource with a relatively small investment, which is why it has garnered so much support. So I want to lean on that point for a moment. it's a very modest investment that then leverages all of these partnerships, which promote access to the Chesapeake Bay. And I think that's why it's been so successful. In demonstration of that support, I have a letter that's signed by many leaders of organizations across the watershed that have been working in this space on behalf of the health of Chesapeake Bay. I know Joel Dunn from the Chesapeake Conservancy is with us today. I want to thank his organization for their great work. I also have a letter from the Maryland Department of Natural Resources endorsing the bill, and I'd ask unanimous consent that those two letters be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. To close, I urge my colleagues to allow the Park Service to uphold its commitment to the region, to the Bay, and to support this bill. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
I want to say something.
Thank you, Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Young?
The gentleman from Maryland, that bill also came through my committee when I was chairman. So you got some support. I gave birth to that child in '98, and I've watched it grow, and you've done an excellent job, and it's a very bright spot in the environmental movement, which some people don't give me credit for, but it has worked. I thank the gentleman.
Thank you very much, Congressman Young, for the support along the way, and this is a bipartisan effort. It always has been. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush.
Allowing me to testify today in support of my bill, H.R. 1130, the Fort Pillow National Battlefield Park Study Act. As a veteran myself, it is important for me to stand up on behalf of all the valiant soldiers who fought and died at Fort Pillow in Henning, Tennessee during the American Civil War. Madam Chair, my bill would simply authorize a special resource study to determine the facts of what happened that fateful day back in 1864, evaluate the site's national significance, and determine the suitability and feasibility of designating the site as a unit of the National Historic Park System. While there has been an ongoing debate and dispute over what happened and whether a massacre occurred, here are a few of the facts as I understand them. On April 12, 1864, Fort Pillow, which was guarded by the 13th Tennessee Cavalry, made up of both white Union soldiers and parts of the 2nd and 6th U.S. Colored Artillery regiments, came under attack by Confederate soldiers. According to the 1864 report conducted by the U.S. Congress Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, entitled the Fort Pillow Massacre, men, women, and even children, wherever found, were deliberately shot down, beaten, and hacked with sabers. According to the report, Madam Chair, the Union garrison consisted of 19 officers and 538 troops, including 280 and 64 United States colored troops. Of the 300 to 400 soldiers known to have been killed at Fort Pillow, at least 300 were murdered in cold blood after the fort had already been overtaken by the rebels and the men had thrown down their arms and ceased to offer resistance. Following this massacre, other black soldiers serving in the Union Army realized that surrendering was not an option, and Fort Pillow became a rallying cry and motivator for the additional 209,147 U.S. colored troops serving during the remainder of the Civil War. Madam Chair, history shows that those 209,000 soldiers fundamentally contributed to the Union's defeat of the Confederacy. Unfortunately, this history has been revised and modified by the state of Tennessee, which claims that what happened at Fort Pillow was not a massacre, and hundreds of surrendering Union troops and innocent civilians did not lose their lives that day. However, Madam Chair, we owe it to those fallen soldiers to correct the record and give them the acknowledgement that they so desperately deserve. As my bill states, this important and historical site deserves to be recognized and commemorated by becoming a national battleground park due to its profound effect on the United States colored troops and on all the Union forces in their fights to preserve the United States of America.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rush. Thank you for that valuable testimony. Mr. Young?
I thank you, Bobby, for your comments. I do have one, just to comment on it. I'm one that represents the state. I'm very sensitive about people that introduce legislation that affects my state without consulting me, and I notice Kustoff is not on it, the congressman. Did you ask him to get on the bill, or was there any communication at all?
We did communicate, and I'm not sure, staff to staff, I don't recall what the level of discussions were or what the outcome of the discussions were. I think that the congressman did not want to get on the bill.
Okay, I just would suggest respectfully that you work together and see if it can be done. If it can't be done, it can't be done. But
I think, as I recall, we were very sensitive to the local congressman, and we attempted to work with him, but because the issue is a pretty controversial issue in his district, he didn't want to get involved in it.
all right, keep it up.
Thank you so much.
Yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rush. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Marshall.
Good morning. On behalf of the 631 Gold Star families whose loved ones made the ultimate sacrifice for our country, let me say thank you to the members of the Natural Resources Committee for taking the time to consider the 1st Infantry Recognition of Sacrifice in Theater Act, the First Act. And a special thanks to Lieutenant General Thomas Rame for his 34 years of military service, as well as his advice and assistance while crafting this legislation. Established in 1917 and calling Fort Riley, Kansas home since 1955, the 1st Infantry Division recently celebrated its 101st anniversary. The Big Red One's history began with firing the first American shots of World War I and soon provided the United States its first victory at the Battle of Cantigny, France. Despite suffering more than 1,000 casualties, the 1st Division captured the village from German forces, defended it against repeated counterattacks, and bolstered the morale of the Allies. In World War II, the 1st Division was the first ashore and led the Allied invasion of North Africa, leading to the defeat of the Axis Africa Corps and capturing over 250,000 soldiers. The division then departed for the invasion of Sicily after a specific request from no other than Lieutenant General George Patton. There they faced fierce mountain combat and suffered heavy casualties, with some units losing over half their strength. The 1st Division would then return to England and once again lead this nation into the invasion of Normandy. They would then go on to fight a continuous offensive across France, the Battle of the Bulge, and into Germany, suffering over 20,000 casualties throughout the war. In 1965, the 1st Infantry Division was the first in battle in Vietnam and later led the Tet Offensive. In 1991, the Big Red One led the way in Desert Storm. From 2003 until most recently, the Big Red One has led the war on terrorism and maintained a strong presence in the Middle East. Today, the Big Red One is protecting our country around the world. Since the division's establishment, the Big Red One has had 35 Medal of Honor recipients. They've suffered 60,000 casualties, and 13,000 soldiers have paid the ultimate sacrifice. It's our duty as members of Congress to ensure these fallen soldiers are not forgotten. Though most of the 13,000 of the fallen have been enshrined at the 1st Division Monument located just south of the White House, we owe it to these other 600 soldiers and their families to add their names. The first act allows the inclusion of names of fallen soldiers who paid the ultimate sacrifice in Operation Iraqi Freedom and New Dawn, as well as the Operating Enduring Freedom. I'm proud as a former officer in our nation's Army to honor the fallen and stand beside our current Big Red One soldiers as they continue to exemplify our motto: no mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great, duty first.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Nagus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the ranking member for holding today's hearing and for allowing us to testify and myself to testify on H.R. 473, which is to establish the Every Word We Utter statute, which could become the first outdoor statute in tribute to the women's suffrage movement in Washington, D.C. As my colleagues in the committee will note, 100 years and 1 day ago, the U.S. House of Representatives passed House Joint Resolution 1, proposing an amendment to the Constitution extending the right to vote to women. It took just over a year for the states to ratify this amendment, forever enshrining women's right to vote in our Constitution. At the forefront of this effort was a diverse and multi-generational movement of women. From their first official call for equality at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 to demonstrations in the streets of the very city in which we sit now. Across multiple generations from farms and villages throughout our nation, women organized, educated, picketed, and demanded their enfranchisement. And through this brave and enduring movement, women received the vote. And they have never looked back. Today, women vote in higher numbers than men and have done so in every election since 1964. I'm honored to be joined at this hearing in support of this bill by Jane DeDecker, a Colorado resident and constituent of mine in Loveland, nationally renowned sculptor and the artist behind this statue. Jane has been sculpting the human figure for over 35 years. In her work, she seeks to capture moments that reveal truths about the human condition. She has placed over 175 life and monumental-sized public sculptures in over 33 states. Jane's beautifully crafted design in Every Word We Utter brings to life the women behind the suffrage movement from its beginning to its final victory. I also feel very privileged to be joined by another constituent, Jody Shattuck McNally, who is the president of the Every Word We Utter board, and as I mentioned, a constituent of mine as well. Together, they both, along with the rest of the board, have advocated tirelessly for the placement of this statue and for national recognition of the movement for women's suffrage. Their dedication has led to several successes, of course, including the bill that is before this committee. H.R. 473, I would note, has received strong bipartisan support. It has the support of the entire congressional delegation of Colorado, every Republican and every Democrat. And it will be bicameral with the bipartisan Senate companion that was introduced just yesterday. Leading women organizations are in support of this legislation, including the 6 chapters of the American Association of University Women, among them the chapters of the states of Colorado and Nevada, as well as the League of Women Voters of Colorado. At the end of my remarks, will ask for unanimous consent to also enter into the record a letter of support for this statute from the American Association of the University of Women of Colorado. The Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission is also supportive of this statute, and I am honored to have with us today the Commission's National Events Director, Anna Lehman, who is here today and will testify, I believe, as part of the third panel, on the significance of the legislation and the statute. Under the Commemorative Works Act, this sculpture can be donated to the National Park Service with our congressional authorization. This bill simply authorizes that private donation, stipulates that this statue will not cost anything to the federal government, and while the bill suggests a preferred location, it leaves the ultimate decision to the National Capital Memorial Advisory Committee, which I think is appropriate. The women included in this sculpture, just by way of background, hail from every corner of this country, diverse set of backgrounds and circumstances. The statue depicts Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, Sojourner Truth, Alice Paul, and Ida B. Wells, all renowned women's rights activists and foundational members of this multi-generational movement. Each of these women's efforts across the decades was irreplaceable to the ultimate enfranchisement of women throughout our nation. And that includes, as I mentioned, Sojourner Truth, who as a former slave became an outspoken advocate for civil and women's rights in the 19th century. My daughter, as some members know, my wife and I welcomed our first child last year, Natalie, and she's just 8 months old now. And as a proud father, I want to ensure that her and every girl growing up alongside her feel represented, empowered, and are assured of the fundamental role that they play in our society. And establishing this statute, in my view, is certainly a critical way we can do just that, and we can inspire the next generation to continue advocating for justice and equality for one another and for all that will follow them. And so with that, I want to thank, again, the chairman, the chairwoman, and the ranking member for hearing this bill today, and I look forward to the conversation ahead. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Great. I thank the sponsoring members of Congress for their valuable testimony. I now invite panel 2 to take their places at the witness table. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be part of the hearing record. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left, and they will turn red when the time has expired. After the witness has testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask questions. Ready? Okay. The chair now recognizes Mr. Daniel Smith, Deputy Director of National Park Service.
Chairman and Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to present the Department of the Interior's views on the 14 bills on today's agenda. I'd like to submit our full statements for the record and summarize the department's views. 4 of the bills would authorize studies. They are H.R. 1130, Fort Pillow, H.R. 1487, Los Angeles Coastal Areas, H.R. 2369, Long Island Aviation, and H.R. 2490, Chief Standing Bear Trail. Except for Long Island Aviation, where key resources no longer remain, these subjects would be appropriate for study. Currently, however, we are focusing resources on reducing the National Park Service's $11.9 billion deferred maintenance backlog and addressing other critical national park needs. In addition, the National Park Service has not yet completed 30 studies on other sites that Congress previously authorized. If the committee acts on these bills, we would like to recommend amendments for H.R. 1130 and H.R. 1487. 2 bills would address memorials in the nation's capital. H.R. 1088 would authorize modifications to the 1st Division Monument located in President's Park. We do not object to this bill. H.R. 473 would authorize the organization named the Every Word We Utter Monument to establish a commemorative work honoring the effort to pass the 19th Amendment. We ask the committee to defer action on this bill until the organization receives approval from the IRS of its 501c3 status. If the committee acts on this bill, we recommend one amendment. 2 bills would extend authorities for existing programs. H.R. 307 would extend the authority through fiscal 2028 and increase the authorization to $20 million annually for the American Battlefield Protection Program Land Acquisition Program. It would allow up to 10% of the funds to be used for battlefield interpretation and restoration, which we support but recommend amending. H.R. 2427 would extend authority for the Chesapeake Bay Gateways and Water Trails Network through fiscal 2025. The President's fiscal year 2020 budget request does not include funding for this program. Two bills would establish new entities for the National Park Service to manage or coordinate. H.R. 1179 would establish the African American Burial Ground Network, and H.R. 2525 would designate the Steel Valley National Storage Area. The department recognizes the important contribution to America's story that is represented by African American burial grounds. However, we do not support H.R. 1179 at this time. If the committee acts on this legislation, we recommend providing for a study rather than establishing a new program. With respect to the proposed Steel Valley National Heritage Area, a feasibility study of the area has not yet been conducted and therefore has not been reviewed by the National Park Service to determine if it meets criteria as a National Heritage Area. I would like to note that the National Heritage Area Program legislation I testified on last month before this committee would establish criteria in law, not just administratively, that would enable us to determine whether an area is appropriate for congressional designation as a National Historic Landmark, among other things. We continue to look forward to working with you on that legislation. Regarding the four other bills, H.R. 1472 would redesignate the Homestead National Monument of America as Homestead National Historical Park. This proposed designation fits with our standard naming conventions for parks, and we support this bill. H.R. 1248 would include the York River in the Wild and Scenic River System. We ask the committee to defer action on this bill until the river study is completed this summer. H.R. 182 would extend the authorization for the Cape Cod National Seashore Advisory Commission for 10 years. At this time, we do not support this bill, but if the committee acts on this legislation, we recommend amending the underlying law to remove a provision that gives the commission a specific role involving park management that no other National Park Advisory Commission has. Finally, H.R. 1727 would allow a tax credit for donations of land for national scenic trails. We defer to the Department of the Treasury for a position on that bill. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my statement, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. The chair now will recognize members for questions, and under Committee Rule 3D, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes. I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes. H.R. 1727 completes America's Great Trails Act. Across the country, National Scenic Trails provide outstanding recreational opportunities and benefits to local economies. In my home state of Arizona, the 800-mile Arizona National Scenic Trail is one of our state's greatest natural resources and economic drivers. However, across the nation, over 4,000 miles of National Scenic Trails are hosted by private landowners, making these privately hosted sections particularly vulnerable. Deputy Director Smith, do you believe that fragmented National Scenic Trails without easements are a concern that pose a threat to the continuity and future use of the trails, of those trails?
Congressman, I'd say it's certainly an issue. It's certainly a private property issue. And as we said in our testimony, it's certainly a major tax issue to allow a tax credit for donated property. But I will say we have an unbelievably successful National Trail Systems program in this country. I certainly understand the rationale for this bill, but again, my testimony is that it's a tax bill, and thus the Treasury Department would have to provide additional information.
Great, thank you. Regarding H.R. 2490, the National Park Service is often referred to as America's storyteller. However, our public lands often fail to capture the diverse story of America's history, especially that of indigenous communities. Deputy Director Smith, in your testimony you stated that Chief Standing Bear Trail would be an appropriate subject for study as a potential National Historic Trail. The site has extreme significance to tribal communities, and its story reflects a shameful history of federal policy towards tribes. Can you elaborate on why the NPS believes the trail is nationally significant?
Well, I do not know the actual details of everything, but it's certainly hearing the Congressman's presentation this morning on the bill. This was a very important time in our history, and especially in that legal case. There are many stories that we are starting to tell in different ways in this country that are now reflected in the National Park System. And as I said, this is a very appropriate study for the significance of what happened to Chief Standing Bear and the rationale for a trail.
Thank you. I yield time now to Mr. Ice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Deputy Director. Good to see you again. I just wanted to take a brief moment to say it's good to see you here, and I'm looking forward to being with you next week at a visit at Kettle Creek. Appreciate the opportunity to work with you and your team to set that up, and just the overall support of the bill to preserve America's battlefield. We are looking forward to working with you on the proposed amendment. I think that will strengthen the bill, and I appreciate that. But thank you again for your support and for being here again today. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. And I would like now to recognize Mr. McEachin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank our witness, Mr. Smith, from the National Park Service, for joining us today. I'm honored and excited to be here to discuss the African American Burial Grounds Network Act, legislation that I introduced along with Congresswoman Alma Adams to preserve and protect some of our most sacred spaces. Mr. Chairman, for far too long, African American burial grounds have suffered neglect and abuse. Beginning with slavery, continuing into the Jim Crow era, African Americans were restricted in where they could bury their deceased. Local laws segregated burial grounds by race. These burial sites were often confined to marginal property or remote areas, and frequently failed to receive necessary monetary support or maintenance. As a result, many African American burial grounds are in a state of disrepair or inaccessibility. We have seen this across the country and in my own backyard. As you see on the monitor, you'll see pictures of Evergreen and East End cemeteries, both historically important to the African American community in Richmond, Virginia, and are in need of preservation and restoration. Fortunately, there are some citizen groups that are going through that process now. Although these sites are the final resting place for some of Richmond's most notable and formidable African American leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs, they were allowed to fall into a deep state of neglect. I first became aware of this injustice when I was a delegate in the Virginia General Assembly. As I learned through the Virginia state budget, I was shocked to learn that historic black cemeteries did not receive funding from the Commonwealth of Virginia for maintenance and preservation, even as some Confederate burial sites did. If efforts were going to be made to preserve the Commonwealth's history and culture, then it was imperative that those efforts tell the whole story. I would file a series of bills shortly thereafter to rectify this wrong, and I was grateful to see similar legislation signed into law 2 years ago that would provide modest funding for both the preservation of Evergreen and East End. For African Americans from the Richmond area, however, the painful reality of being unable to visit and mourn the deceased persists. Despite years of hard work by dedicated volunteers, church congregations, families of the interred, nonprofits, and concerned state lawmakers, both East End and Evergreen cemeteries are still in a shocking state of disarray. While the two burial grounds together comprise more than 70 acres, only a minuscule fraction of the graves are easily accessible. Most are tragically forgotten. What remains are collapsed headstones, defaced memorials, and ground depressions. Families are unable to locate and visit their loved ones. Again, this injustice is not unique to Richmond or Virginia. It's typical of the tragic reality facing communities across the country. That is why H.R. 1179, the African American Burial Grounds Network, is so important. Our legislation seeks to address these injustices. The act is simple. It establishes a voluntary network of historic African American burial grounds through the National Park Service. The act really does speak for itself, and I'm beginning to run a little short on time, Mr. Chairman, but I'll say this: I am respectful of the Park Service's role that it plays in preserving and protecting history and culture of communities across this country. I find it ironic that this is the 400th year that the first Africans came to this shore, to our shores in Virginia, in chains. Since those first Africans died, we've had time to study this type of legislation. I would submit, Mr. Chairman, that the time for study is past, the time for action has taken place. The act speaks for itself. It's a voluntary, it is a voluntary network. And I'm more than sure that the Park Service can absorb the work necessary to make sure those grounds that volunteer for participation in this program are adequately serviced. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. I now recognize Representative DeGette from Colorado.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much, Mr. Smith, for coming over here today. I want to, I think these 14 National Park Service bills are so important. Of course, being from Colorado, we're really proud of our national parks in Colorado. We have Rocky Mountain National Park, Mesa Verde, Great Sand Dunes, Black Canyon of the Gunnison, and also Dinosaur National Monument, which is administered by the Park Service. But you know, it's not just limited to national parks as we're talking about here today, because we can talk about national battlefields, memorials, historic sites, and so many more. This is really the star in our whole public land system. And so I wanted to ask you, Deputy Director Smith, in places like Colorado, we have a part of the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, which was acquired through the National Park Service's American Battlefield Protection Program. It talks about the inhumane and deadly attacks on the Cheyenne and Arapaho people, and it educates generations about what happened there. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that protecting nationally significant battlegrounds is critical to the future and preservation of our national heritage?
Congresswoman, yes. Whether it be the Rev War, the Civil War, or the Indian Wars, that's a story of this nation that needs to be told. And the Sand Creek Massacre, it has just recently been told.
Right.
We are catching up with a lot of our history, just as the Chief Standing Bear Trail would do. So, yes, affirmative to your question.
And in addition, it's also a good return on investment, because the land acquisition grant program often exceeds the matching requirement for federal funding. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
So it's a total win-win, financially and culturally. I also, let's see, I guess that's about it. That's what I have to say, and I want to thank you for coming today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. I thank the witness for their valuable testimony and members for their questions. I now invite panel 3 to take their places at the witness table. As for the first 2 panels, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be part of the hearing record. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left, and they will turn red when the time has expired. After the witnesses have testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask them questions. The chair now recognizes Dr. Charles Ott, Chair of the York River Study Commission.
Ranking member and honorable members of the committee, I am Chuck Ott from York, Maine. I'm the chair of the York River Study Committee, and I'm here to provide testimony in support of House Bill 1248, the York River Wild and Scenic River Act. Although the York River runs only 13 miles from its headwaters to the sea, it runs through 400 years of colonial and U.S. history, and of course for thousands of years of our First Nation history. For most of those years, the river was the highway that linked our people, and now it's the history that continues to bind us together. The York River contains 9 sites listed on the National Register as historic places, roughly 100 archaeological sites, including Native American sites dating as far back as 5,000 years ago, and colonial settlement sites from the 1600s. At low tide, one can see the remnants of one of the first tide-powered sawmills in America, dating to 1634. The oldest standing house in Maine, the McIntyre Garrison, was built on the shores in 1707. John Hancock's warehouse and Mark Twain's summer residence stand on the banks of the York River. At the confluence of the northern and southern forests, the York River watershed supports an explosion of biodiversity, including productive habitats for alewife, American eel, brook trout, rainbow smelt, and winter flounder. The York River water supply system provides drinking water to Kittery, portions of York and Elliott, and the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. We embarked on this effort 10 years ago when we first met with boards of selectmen, conservation commissions, planning boards, harbor boards, historical societies, land trusts, state officials, Rotary clubs, and the Lobstermen's Association. We learned a lot over the last 10 years. We learned that when lobstermen convene a meeting, no one sits down. We learned that the York working waterfront, which is a model for all of Maine, is also a model for us in forging creative solutions for our fishing industry and our economy. We learned that self-governance can play a major role in protecting natural resources. Our inspiration is Gary Stevens, who works as a York Water District worker. He was given a bicycle and instructions to talk with people visiting the Water District, explaining why there were restrictions on swimming and campfires. Within a year, infractions, which had become quite high, fell to near zero. Gary's a little older now, so they've given him an ATV. We learned that property owners along the river deserve a great deal of credit for protecting the river over the past 400 years, and the critical importance of continuing to protect their rights. So we had an election last November. The question of whether or not we should adopt the York River Stewardship Plan and its recommendation that we seek designation as a partnership wild and scenic river was put before the voters of York, Elliott, Kittery, and South Berwick. As New Englanders are wont to do, we had a spirited debate over this question. In that debate, no one was entirely right, and no one was entirely wrong. The measure passed in all four towns.
Dr. Odd, we're going to have to interrupt you. Your time has expired,
All right?
but we'll certainly have time to come back to you with questions.
Okay.
The chair now recognizes Mrs. Sherry Lee Lincoln, Director of American Studies at Georgetown University.
Thank you, Congressman Meacham, and thank you to the members of the committee.
I should begin by explaining why, as an American Studies professor at Georgetown, I'm here to talk to you about the Steel Valley Heritage Area in northeastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania. I spent 17 years as the co-director and one of the founders of the Center for Working Class Studies at Youngstown State University, and I'm the co-author with John Russo of Steeltown, USA, Work and Memory in Youngstown, a book that studies the history of that region and talks about the stories that are told there. I believe a copy of that book has been provided to the committee, so what I'm going to say will draw from that. In a 1996 interview about Bruce Springsteen's song about Youngstown, Washington Post photographer Michael Williamson, who himself had written and done some beautiful photographs about the Youngstown area, offered the best explanation for why the Steel Valley Heritage Area matters. Youngstown's story, he said, is America's story. John Russo and I have quoted Williamson many times over the last 20 years as we have written about the Youngstown area and spoken with hundreds of students, community members, and reporters about industrialization and deindustrialization and the region's persistence over 4 decades since the loss of the steel industry that shaped its economy and defined its identity. To say that Youngstown's story is America's story recognizes that this community's history of industrial strength and innovation is at once unique and typical. The details are particular to this area. The natural resources of Briar Hill black coal that made Youngstown the home of iron and steel manufacturing, the innovative design of the GM Lordstown auto plant in the 1960s, and the research and development that continues today in advanced manufacturing and a small but growing tech sector. But the underlying story reflects a national narrative about America's role as an economic leader. Youngstown's story is also a tale of a vibrant American city that was shaped by immigrants and migrants who came in search of jobs. They also built the institutions that fostered what sociologist Robert N. Bella has called a community of memory, a set of ideas and shared experiences, both good and bad, that create a sense of place. Across the Steel Valley Heritage Area, people established the churches, unions, museums, symphonies, schools, and universities that brought people together, that occasionally divided them, and that gave this region important sources of pride and identity. Of course, Youngstown's story is also one of struggle and resilience. Since the late 1970s, Youngstown has been treated as the poster child for deindustrialization by journalists, filmmakers, and artists who have examined the causes and the social costs of deindustrialization through the lens of this community. Soon after the steel mills shut down, Youngstown became famous for organizing the first ever American proposal for a community to buy and operate a local industry. While that effort ultimately failed, the story remains powerful for many, as does the community's continuing responses to the half-life of deindustrialization. The Steel Valley Heritage Area still draws national and international attention. In recent weeks, it has been the focus of a power photojournalism piece in the New York Times Magazine, focused on how local families are being affected by the closing of the Lordstown plant. It hosted the labor attaché from the German embassy for site visits and talks about changes in work, and welcomed delegations from global businesses and communities who want to learn about Youngstown's business incubator, its neighborhood revitalization projects, and the development of advanced manufacturing. This area has a rich and significant history of growth, struggle, and resilience. We must recognize and preserve its history now, because we are beginning to lose the generation that lived through both the heyday of the steel mills and their closings. The memory and appreciation of their work and their experience deserves more attention. By supporting and coordinating cultural heritage efforts, the Steel Valley Heritage Area will help to ensure that the history of this region will not be forgotten. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Judy Goshkabas. Was that even close?
Good morning, Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. I am Judy Goshkabosh, an enrolled member of the Ponca Tribe of Nebraska and the Executive Director of the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today in support of H.R. 2490. I would also like to thank Congressman Fortenberry for his continued leadership in championing the legacy of Chief Standing Bear in Nebraska and beyond. H.R. 2490 is the critical first step to direct the National Park Service to perform a feasibility study to designate the Chief Standing Bear National Historic Trail. As a Ponca tribal member, this piece of history is very personal to me, but beyond my personal connection, I truly believe it is a story worth documenting for the rest of the nation and a story that resonates with everyone that hears it. By way of background, Chief Standing Bear was born on the banks of the Niobrara River in Nebraska, where our tribe traditionally lived. In 1877, by federal treaty, the United States forcibly removed Chief Standing Bear and our tribe from our homeland in Nebraska to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. Chief Standing Bear and the Ponca people walked over 500 miles from Nebraska to Oklahoma, enduring hardships of travel, illness, and the harsh conditions of Indian Territory. Sadly, many members of our tribe perished during the first year in Indian Territory, including Chief Standing Bear's 16-year-old son, Bear Shield. Bear Shield's dying wish to his father was to be buried back in our homelands along the Niobrara River. Determined to grant his son's dying wish, Chief Standing Bear led 30 members, including women and children, on the long 500-mile walk back from Indian Territory to our home in Nebraska. But 2 days short of our ancestral homelands, he was arrested by the United States Army for leaving Indian Territory and marched to Fort Omaha. Aided by the help of local attorneys, Chief Standing Bear sued the federal government, seeking his freedom and right to return to his homeland. At the trial, as Congressman Fortenberry so eloquently recited earlier, Chief Standing Bear spoke his famous words. On May 12, 1879, Chief Standing Bear and the Ponca people were victorious when the federal judge ruled for the first time in American history, an Indian is a person within the meaning of the law. The story of Chief Standing Bear has been widely recognized and celebrated in the state of Nebraska and throughout Indian country. This bill is an opportunity to share this significant human and civil rights story on a national level. Recently, the state of Nebraska chose to highlight the important leadership of Chief Standing Bear by enacting state legislation, LB 807, to place a statue of Standing Bear in the United States Capitol that will be unveiled in the coming months. When you walk through the Capitol, you will be able to see the statue and reflect on Chief Standing Bear's story. We want the Chief Standing Bear Trail to provide that same opportunity to raise awareness about this historic event. To know America's history, you must know our history. The trail will educate the public about Chief Standing Bear and the Ponca tribe's forced relocation and our long journey back to our homelands, and will serve as a starting point to bring about a greater understanding of tribal sovereignty, tribal rights, human rights, and equality for all peoples. Importantly, because the trail will follow the general corridor in which the journey originally occurred rather than the actual land the Poncas walked, the trail will not impact any private property rights. The story of Chief Standing Bear and the Ponca people is a story of honor, courage, perseverance, and patriotism. It is a story of freedom, spiritual resolve, love of family, and love of country. It is a story that reflects all the values that Americans cherish and hold dear. The National Park Service must conduct a feasibility study before the trail can be statutorily established. This chapter in the United States history deserves to be honored and told. It is a story that resonates not only with Native people, but with all Americans. In closing, I would like to take a moment to thank Chief Standing Bear and all my Ponca ancestors who had the courage and fortitude to walk 1,000 miles so that I could be here today. I look forward to working with this committee to ensure passage of this legislation so that Chief Standing Bear National Historic Trail is one step closer to becoming a reality. I am happy to answer any questions you may have. Wiblaho.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Angela Thorp, Director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission.
Greetings. Again, my name is Angela Thorp, and I direct the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, which is a division of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources under the leadership of Secretary Susie Hamilton. And I do want to recognize Congresswoman Adams. The commission was established in 2008 under her leadership during her tenure in the North Carolina General Assembly. So this is certainly a full circle moment for us. A few short days ago, I had the pleasure of participating in an African American burial grounds workshop in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was eager to join colleagues and constituents as we engaged in a day of education here, Middleville Cemetery. Middleville Cemetery was established in the late 19th century as a private burial ground for African Americans, and early surveys of the cemetery revealed a small number of burial sites and markers on the property. But as is the case for many African American burial grounds, what meets the eye rarely reveals the truth. A comprehensive survey of the cemetery revealed this: hundreds of unmarked graves that lay beneath the surface of this plot of land. This likely would not have been revealed without some of the very actions H.R. 1179 calls for, namely identification of African American burial grounds, thorough efforts made to record grave sites, and technical assistance to support community-led preservation efforts. This work that has been done in Middleville is just one example of what this bill has the power to yield across the nation. Historically, African American burial practices have been severely restricted. Everything from plantation politics to legal restrictions played a role in shaping how, when, and where African Americans were buried. Additionally, untold numbers of African Americans have migrated across the country. Their family homes and family lands have changed hands over time, and African American community landscapes have changed drastically over time. Thus, historically, African American cemeteries are often left under-resourced, underdocumented, and without consistent care on remote properties or within marginalized communities. This adversely affects decision makers on a national scale. As cities continue to grow and evolve at a rapid rate in this country, a comprehensive, streamlined, and clear strategy for identifying and documenting African American burial grounds is critical. Ultimately, these grounds will continue to be disturbed by construction projects, infrastructure improvements, and land development as long as they remain undocumented. And I do want to note that a community group in Philadelphia initiated the map on the screen that you see in an effort to preserve African American burial grounds in response to consistent disturbances of these grounds led by construction projects in the city. The database proposed by H.R. 1179 will play a key role in mitigating against incidents like this, ultimately leveraging community-based technical assistance to better inform development decisions and future community planning. And I'll also note that H.R. 1179 responds directly to the needs of constituents across the nation. In fact, the most frequent constituent requests that I receive working with the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission relate directly to documenting, preserving, and researching African American burial grounds across North Carolina. In the last 4 weeks alone, I have fielded 4 such requests, including one related to providing research support to a cemetery in Asheville, North Carolina, and another related to offering preservation support to a community cemetery with Gullah Geechee roots in Southport, North Carolina. The requests here are so consistent that we are partnering with the Office of State Archaeology to develop an initiative to respond to these needs. And so, again, I encourage you, just like the North Carolina Department of Natural Cultural Resources and grassroots groups and nonprofits across the country to support this effort. Thank you so much for having me here today.
And the committee thanks you as well. I'm now going to recognize myself for 5 minutes as we go into the question and answer period by members. Ms. Thorp, we know that many African-American burial grounds across the country are in a state of disrepair or inaccessibility. Can you speak to the scope of this issue and the various challenges that these sacred sites face?
Absolutely. Per my mention in my remarks, historically, African American cemeteries have been forced to essentially exist on the margins, in large part due to legal restrictions. So oftentimes these cemeteries are relegated to remote areas or, again, within marginalized communities. And over time, local groups, volunteer groups, and church groups have been responsible for maintaining these spaces, yet those groups are incredibly under-resourced. I think a really great example is a historically African-American cemetery in Milton, North Carolina. It lays adjacent to a predominantly white cemetery. There's a chain link fence that separates the two, and a local women's auxiliary group maintains the white cemetery, while no funds are provided for a black church to maintain their cemetery. And so again, this is just an example of an under-resourced cemetery. These groups oftentimes also lack the technical knowledge, resources, or even human capacity to tend to these cemeteries as well. So it's critical to support the work of these groups.
There are various efforts, as you've just noted, at the state, local, and even private levels to preserve and protect African American cemeteries. How will this legislation complement those efforts, and what is the value of creating a national network to collect information in one central location?
So I think that this bill, H.R. 1179, essentially will level the playing field for groups across the country. As I've noted, there are a number of efforts across the United States to preserve these cemeteries. Government agencies, local groups, nonprofits are all working to do this work. However, the work is fractured. There's nothing streamlined and clear to help these groups. And so a central space for resources, a really clear chain of command on how to respond to cemetery preservation, and a central database will help these groups significantly. Additionally, many of the items that this bill outline will help these local groups to navigate these processes with municipalities and government agencies as well, which is a critical point of connection for this work.
You know, Ms. Thorpe, it's a priority for me that we preserve the history and culture of minority and underserved communities so that we may tell and illustrate a more complete and inclusive American story. I know you and I share that commitment. Can you explain to the committee why it is so important that we achieve this shared goal?
Absolutely. The stories that I've talked about, the stories that lie beneath the ground of these cemeteries, have always been a part of the American story. In large part, they've been suppressed or have not been recognized. And so this is an opportunity to give voice to my ancestors, as well as the ancestors of some of the very people in this room. This is an opportunity to share a history across the nation, again, that has generally gone unrecognized, and create a fuller scope of the American story.
Thank you, Ms. Thorpe, and I'll yield back. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony. Mr. Curtis. I now recognize Mr. Curtis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Special thanks to our witnesses that are here with us today. I no doubt many of you have traveled some distance to be here with us. Dr. Ott, thank you for your testimony. I understand that these so-called partnerships, these wild and scenic rivers, receive National Park Service funding, support, and technical assistance. However, the legislation states that the river will not be part of the national park system and not subject to NPS regulations. The cynical part of me wants to say, is that because these regulations are overly burdensome?
Are they considered unnecessary? Can you give me some insight into to why we're not subjecting them to these regulations?
My understanding is that because a partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers often, if not always, run through private property, that the Wild and Scenic law was redesigned for those specific circumstances, so that we as a community continue to make the decisions regarding land use in our own communities. The law does not allow the National Park Service to do that. In fact, it's not administered by the National Park Service at all. I think they do want to have oversight. If they're going to offer us funding, they want to be sure that we're using it in the right way.
I think what I'm hearing I really like, and that is that local people with boots on the ground sometimes understand these situations better than those 2,000 miles away, and we should trust their judgment.
It's all about local control and local people, and we took our inspiration from local examples.
You've made me very happy today, Dr. Ott.
Thank you.
I represent a group of people thousands of miles away from the federal government who feel much the same way. Ms. Lincoln, typically before Congress designates a new national heritage area, we ask that a Park Service endorsed feasibility study be complete. As a matter of fact, in our recent Large Lands Package Act, there were 6 of these, and every one of them had a feasibility study. Has one been completed for the Still Valley National Heritage Area?
As I understand it, no.
Can you give me some insight into why we wouldn't complete that?
I was not part of the process part of the group that made that decision, so I don't know. I can tell you that there is a fairly established history in this area, and part of the consultation that John Russo and I did with Congressman Ryan's office was talking about what kinds of resources were there on the ground. So we've had some of those kinds of conversations, but I don't believe a formal study has been completed, and I don't know why.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to try this. Mrs. Gosh Kabosh, thank you. What efforts, can you tell me, I think when we hear a situation like yours, we're always worried that without the legislation you're requesting, that the land is currently, the area is currently not being protected. Can you tell me a little bit about the protections that are in place and how this new designation will better protect the area?
I think rather than say protecting, what it will do is it will elevate the profile. It will be a point of pride, much like other historic trail designations, the Lewis and Clark. And so when visitors come to our homelands in the middle of America, they will see signage that will raise the question of who was Standing Bear, who were the first peoples in Nebraska. And it will also help the non-Indian community as well share in that story, and it will help with ecotourism. And right now we have resolutions from the state of Kansas and Oklahoma to support this. So the trail will go down into Kansas and Oklahoma, and they too will be a part of telling America's first story. And it's really at this time in our history, I think it's so important that we not forget that there were civilizations here and our people were here before. So I'm just really honored that I can come here today before you, and I can trace my family back to 1804, and my grandfather was born in 1878. He was the last chief of the second rank of the Ponca tribe, and our tribe was terminated and restored without a land base. So for the Ponca people, we're a homeless people without a reservation land. And again, this trail for the Ponca would be significant. But for all Native tribes, over 565 federally recognized tribes, this story, for the first time, we were recognized as persons under the law.
That's fantastic. And I don't mean to interrupt, but I am out of time, and we just all thank you for telling that story. And Ms. Thorp, I'm out of time, but also let me thank you for coming for the effort that you're leading as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. I now invite, well, first I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony, each and every one of you, as well as the members who asked questions. Thank you. I now invite panel number 4 to take their places at the witness table. As you do so, as with the first three panels, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be part of the hearing record. Again, your oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be part of the record. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there's 1 minute left, and they'll turn red when time has expired. After the witnesses have testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask them questions. The chair now recognizes Ms. Yolanda Burgess, a descendant of the Fort Pillow Massacre.
Good morning. I am Yolanda Burgess, a resident of Detroit, Michigan, and the great-granddaughter of Armstead Burgess, an African-American soldier who survived the Fort Pillow Massacre on April 12, 1864. It is through his service to this nation that I am a member of the Daughters of Union Veterans of the Civil War, and unfortunately, the descendants of the Fort Pillow Massacre. I note that the Fort Pillow Massacre was investigated in a congressional hearing held on May 5, 1864. Therefore, I think it's very profound that 155 years later, I am here again to discuss the Confederate Army's murder and victimization of men, women, and children after they surrendered. The committee stated then that the fearful and bloody transaction at Fort Pillow would lead to the government's prompt and decisive measures. Those decisive measures should be continued by the passage of the Fort Pillow National Battlefield Park Study Act. The importance of this bill will hopefully be shown by sharing my great-grandfather's story and his audacity to live. I've been asked to share his story. Here is his military record. Beginning in the morning of April 12, 1864, Private Armstead Burgess was engaged in battle at Fort Pillow on the Mississippi River near Henning, Tennessee. The fortification was garrisoned by the 6th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery, 2nd U.S. Colored Light Artillery, and the 13th Tennessee Cavalry. Approximately 589 Union soldiers held their ground and continued their honorable fight against 2,500 Confederates. However, there was no honor in the Confederates as they advanced while the terms of surrender were being negotiated. After the second flag of truce at 3 o'clock, a legitimate battle engagement resulted in a massacre. Private Burgess suffered 2 head injuries and was stabbed in the leg. Despite these injuries, he survived while 335 of his comrades were murdered and executed. An undetermined number of civilian men, women, and children were also murdered. The onslaught was so horrific that the Mississippi River turned red. The next day, Confederate officers were heard bragging about the murders they committed. This was all done under the command of Nathan Bedford Forrest. These atrocities were so outrageous that the 38th Congress Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War determined the following. It's in your committee report from 155 years ago. It stated the following. The rebels commenced an indiscriminate slaughter, sparing neither age nor sex, white nor black soldier nor civilian. The officers and men seemed to vie with each other in the devilish work. Men, women, and their children, with whatever found, were deliberately shot down, beaten, and hacked with sabers. Some of the children, not more than 10 years old, were forced to stand up and face their murderers while being shot. The sick and wounded were butchered without mercy. The rebels even entered the hospital buildings and dragged them out to be shot or kill them as they lay unable to offer the least resistance. 2 weeks afterwards, the fortification and the riverbank was transformed into a burial ground of black and white soldiers and civilians. Skeletal remains were continued to wash up on the shores of the Mississippi for months afterwards. Very few battles faced an investigation and hearing by Congress during the Civil War. The events that took place at Fort Pillow captured the attention of the nation and the world 155 years ago. Fort Pillow was used as a persuasive argument to continue the effort to defeat the Confederate government, which was grounded in racism and inhumanity. After 1864, the outcry of African American freedom fighters was remember Fort Pillow as they realized their pending treatment by the Confederate Army. While Congress held its hearings and newspapers continued to report on the massacre, the Confederates returned Private Burgess to the life of enslavement to work on their fortifications in Alabama and Virginia and Mississippi. He was liberated and returned to his regiment 13 months after the massacre. He was honorably discharged in January of 1866, having been paid only once and having owed the government $45.18. My great-grandfather lived with the wounds of warfare, a beleaguered veteran in the Jim Crow South until 1863. This is a story of Fort Pillow and why it needs some study to turn it over to the National Parks System.
Thank you very much, Ms. Burgess, for that important testimony. The chair now recognizes Lieutenant General Thomas Rame, the former commanding general of the 1st Infantry Division.
Madam Chairman, members of the subcommittee, it's an honor for me to be here today to speak to you on the need to update and modify our 1st Division monument. Approval of H.R. 1088 will accomplish that for us. My name is Lieutenant General Thomas Rame. I had the honor to command the 1st Infantry Division from July of 1989 until July of 1991. During that time, I was privileged to be in command to lead the division during the successful Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm operation in the war against Iraq with the specific purpose of liberating Kuwait from its clutches. After I retired from military service, I did serve for 10 years as the president of the Society of the 1st Division, and I currently serve as a vice president of the Society. The 1st Division Monument is located in President's Park, just west of the White House and south of the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, located on the corner of 17th Street and State Plate Northwest. The monument was conceived by the Society of the 1st Division to commemorate the lives of those members of the division who were killed and fell during World War I. The monument was dedicated on October the 24th of 1924, and the names of 5,560 1st Division soldiers were placed on the base of the monument to commemorate their sacrifice to the division and their service to America. The belief was that by their names being there, they would not be forgotten. On August the 24th of 1957, west of the World War I column, a monument was modified to place the names of the 1st Division soldiers that were killed during World War II. A total of 4,325 names were added to the monument at that time. These soldiers were killed at such places as North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the Hurtgen Forest, the Siegfried Line, and countless other places where the division fought to liberate Western Europe. On August the 20th of 1977, a mirror image of the World War II edition was dedicated to add the names of those 1st Division soldiers that were killed during the Vietnam War. This edition was placed just east of the World War I column, and the names of 3,079 more killed were added to the monument. On May the 29th, 1995, we dedicated the Desert Storm plaque to commemorate the sacrifice of 29 soldiers killed during that war. This plaque was placed in a flower bed just east of the World War I column where it is today.
The 1st Infantry Division has served our country proudly for over 100 years of continuous and unbroken service. At present, a total of 12,949 names of fallen soldiers are inscribed and commemorated on the monument. These fallen have followed our commitment to America and lived up to our division motto of no mission too difficult, no sacrifice too great, duty first, as they fell doing service for America. It is time to update and add names to our monument. We need to add 439 names of soldiers of the division who were killed during Operation Iraqi Freedom and New Dawn, that is, service during the Iraq War, and the names of 192 soldiers killed during Operation Enduring Freedom in service in Afghanistan. Additionally, we plan to place the names of the 29 soldiers from Desert Storm on an identical plaque adjacent to these new names that will be added for Iraq and Afghanistan. This will make needed repairs to the Desert Storm plaque, and it will give greater and better symmetry to the monument. Adequate space is already available to complete the comprehensive design without increasing the footprint of the monument. Our goal is to complete the design so that these and future additions can be undertaken in a consistent and respectful way. HOK Architects of Washington over in Georgetown is our architect. The cost for the design is most reasonable, and they have generously discounted it for the society. HOK Architects gave us several options to work with. The society completed a decision on the options, and HOK will finalize the drawings as soon as we have permission and approval of HR 1088 to do so. As in the past, the Society of the 1st Division, veterans of the division have stepped up to bear the cost of adding the new names to the monument. Our veterans and friends of the division have been generous with their donations. We have the money and the resources to do it, and we need no outside help.
Lieutenant General Rain.
Strongly encourage you to pass 1088.
Thank you
Madam
very
Chairman.
much for your testimony, sir. Thank you, Lieutenant General. The chair now recognizes Mr. Richard Delaney, President and CEO of the Center for Coastal Studies. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member, members, good morning. I am here in support of H.R. 182. I am Richard Delaney. I am also the president of the Center for Coastal Studies, an independent nonprofit marine research, education, and policy organization. But more importantly, I have the privilege of serving as the chair of the Cape Cod National Seashore Advisory Commission, and I'm here today to urge your support for H.R. 182, a bill that would simply reauthorize the existence of the commission for another 10 years. This bill has profound importance for the future management of Cape Cod National Seashore and its critical partnerships and relationships with the 6 local towns within the boundary of Cape Cod National Seashore. It has worked very well for over 60 years of operation. It has provided a key forum for coordination and communication among and between the local communities and National Park Service management, and has been an outstanding example of a partnership in cooperative land stewardship within the national park system. The Cape Cod National Seashore Advisory Commission was authorized in 1961 as part of the enabling legislation for the entire park. Its purpose is to provide a means of ongoing consultation and liaison with private, local, and community interests that were expected to remain inside the park. We have members representing one from each of the 6 towns, 2 representing the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, 1 the local county, Barnstable County, and 1 appointed by the Secretary of Interior here in Washington. The park itself is most unusual within the Park Service. The boundaries of Cape Cod National Seashore incorporated significant portions of the 6 lower Cape towns. However, the towns retained ownership of numerous parcels within the seashore, including ponds, beaches, parking lots, and roads, and there still exists over 600 private parcels within the boundary. Activities on all these lands can have potentially profound effects on the resources and vice versa. Consequently, at the outset,
there was intense political debate about and considerable local opposition to the original proposal to create Cape Cod National Seashore. The need for a forum for open, constructive dialogue where the towns and private sector had a voice was resolved by the establishment of Cape Cod National Seashore Advisory Commission. And that need continues today as new issues emerge and others reappear. It is fair to say that the Cape Cod National Seashore Advisory Commission was one, if not the key, to the successful establishment of the Seashore Park. Since that time, we have conducted over 300 publicly conducted, transparent meetings and established an excellent reputation as a facilitator of vital public-private dialogue. We meet 6 or 7 times per year. Occasionally, we form a subcommittee to examine in more detail specific issues. Town representatives can bring any issue or concern to the attention of the Advisory Commission and Park Management. That provides a much valued direct access to park management. At the same time, superintendents can bring and solicit attention from the towns on issues that are emerging from the federal side. We have helped many Cape Cod National Seashore superintendents deal with important issues such as the management of off-road vehicles using beaches, location of bike trails, land exchanges, hunting, environmental impact statements, development pressures, and so forth and so on. In each case, the advice and recommendation from the towns via the Advisory Commission has resulted in a well-reasoned outcome acceptable to all parties. One major concern at the outset was how and to what degree commercial ventures would be allowed within the park's boundaries. Local officials worried about rampant commercialization and just plain competition with existing businesses that support the towns. I have served in the commission in various appointments for over 20 years, and that issue is not as major anymore. In fact, there are only 8 pre-existing commercial permits allowed within the Park Service. They are routinely reviewed and approved. The fact is that the 4 million visitors that come to visit Cape Cod National Seashore provide a backbone for much of the lower Cape economy. The cost of the operating of the commission is negligible, about $7,000. We all are volunteers. In closing, I can assure you that the town representatives, the Commonwealth, the private businesses and homeowners all are fully supportive of this legislation. We thank you for your full support of it in last year's version. We hope you will move to pass it again this year. And thank you once again. I'd be happy to answer questions or elaborate when it comes time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Delaney. The chair now recognizes Ms. Anna Lehman, the National Events Director of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission.
Good morning, everyone. So good morning to the chair, to the ranking member, to committee members, and my fellow witnesses gathered here today. I want to say, sitting in this room, I have been so struck by the mission that you all have to preserve and tell the untold stories of American history. It's been moving to be here today, for sure. I am thrilled to be here to discuss H.R. 473, to place the Every Word We Utter statue in Washington, D.C. as the first outdoor statue dedicated to the women's suffrage movement in our nation's capital. My name is Anna Lehman, and I am the National Events Director for the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. We were created by Congress in 2017 to coordinate the nationwide celebration of the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. The commission works to ensure that the story of women's fight for the ballot is shared and commemorated. The bipartisan commission is chaired by Mrs. Kay Coles James, the president of the Heritage Foundation, and former Senator Barbara Mikulski, so we are truly bipartisan. I actually think I was here yesterday. I think I pinned on a number of your roses as we commemorated the House centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment just yesterday, so it's good to see you all again. I serve a critical role on the commission, coordinating legislative efforts to honor the 19th Amendment, as well as planning the country's nationwide commemorative events and activities. Prior to joining the commission, I worked as the Director of Partnerships and Public Programs for the National Woman's Party, which is the historic nonprofit founded by Alice Paul in 1913 for this very effort to make sure that women had the constitutional right to vote. The NWP actually still operates today. It exists at the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, just on the other side of the hill in the sort of corner of the Hart Senate office building. You've probably walked right by it. And we are still there today. We run that museum, that monument, in partnership with the National Park Service. It is my honor and my privilege to be a part of the team that's coordinating the nationwide efforts to commemorate the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment, and to be here today as a part of that commemoration. So, I join you today to lend my voice to the efforts to create a public monument to commemorate the women who waged and won the fight for women's right to vote. Designed by renowned sculptor Jane DeDecker, who is here sitting behind me today, the statue we are discussing will be cast in bronze. It's approximated to be 21 feet tall and with a 10-foot circular base. It's pretty big. The suggested placement for this statue is near the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument and the Supreme Court. I could not think of a better place to put this public monument for the women's suffrage movement. The statue depicts Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and her daughter Harriet Stanton Blatch, Sojourner Truth, Alice Paul, and Ida B. Wells. These women encapsulate both the sustained activism of the suffrage movement over multiple generations, as well as the diversity and patriotism of this movement. Each of the depicted women brought something unique and irreplaceable to the fight for suffrage. From Sojourner Truth, who threw off the shackles of slavery, fled freedom to the north, and proclaimed to her sisters in suffrage the humanity of women of color when she asked, "Ain't I a woman?" To Alice Paul, who brought women out of the home and into the streets to protest for national change. This statue epitomizes the very tenets of the suffrage movement, tenets on which our nation was founded: freedom, peaceful protest, and millions of diverse voices coming together as one to create change. The true art of this statue, though, it doesn't lie just in who it depicts physically, but in the symbolism of the continued path towards equality that it represents. Just as our nation is an ongoing, evolving experiment in democracy, so too are the movements for equality within it. As Elizabeth Cady Stanton remarked in a letter to Lucretia Mott explaining the continuous nature of this movement, from which the artist Jane DeDecker drew her inspiration for this work, every word we utter, every act we perform, wafts into innumerable circles beyond. So at no cost to the taxpayer, you have the opportunity today to commemorate the women who led our nation to greater equality. There is absolutely no better way to celebrate the centennial of women's suffrage than with this kind of public commemoration, which will create ripples of inspiration for every generation to come. In closing, I would like to quote one of the mothers of the suffrage movement, Alice Paul, the founder of the National Woman's Party, who said, "I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated. But to me, there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality." So on behalf of that ordinary equality, and in honor of all the women who fought for the vote for each of us, those whose stories we know, and those thousands more whose stories we have forgotten, I urge you to support the establishment of the Every Word We Utter statue. Thank you for your time and consideration today.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lehman, for that valuable testimony. And the chair will now recognize Mr. James Heiser, President of the American Battlefield Trust.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is this on? It's on now. Thank you. Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Jim Heiser, and I'm privileged to be President of the American Battlefield Trust. Let me just stop. Before I go another inch forward, let me thank the committee and particularly Congressman Heiss and most particularly the staff of the committee for their wonderful help in getting this bill moving as fast as it has. Madam Chair, I'm a former elected official myself, and I know the crucial importance of staff, so my gratitude. Back to me, I'm privileged to be president of the American Battlefield Trust. And the American Battlefield Trust is a membership-based organization. We have over 50,000 dues-paying members around the country, some 300,000 followers on the social media. And our mission is twofold. One is to save the places where America was created and defined, which are the battlefields of the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. And two, to tell the story of what happened at those places and why it matters today. Because we truly believe that what happened in the Revolutionary War battlefields and in the other two wars created us and defined us as we are as a nation today in many respects. So we save those lands, which we look at as outdoor classrooms, and then tell the stories of what happened there and relate it to Americans today. Basically, we teach civics. And towards that end, our group has been over the last 20 years, been able to save over 50,000 acres of battlefield land, as far west as Glorieta Pass, New Mexico, as far north as you can go, and all the way down into Florida. Some 124 battlefields, something like that, in 24 states across the country, and our work is still much to be done. One of the things that has allowed us, in fact, the most crucial element has been the partnership that has been formed with the United States Congress. And that's something called it's administered by the American Battlefield Protection Program, but it's got the odd name of Battlefield Land Acquisition Grant Program. Basically, it is a federal program that allows $1 of federal money to be spent for protection of battlefield lands, provided it's matched by $1 from non-federal money. So it's been a remarkably efficient program. It's been a remarkably effective program. It has directly resulted, of those 50,000 acres that we've saved, it's directly resulted in the saving of over 30,000 of those acres. So what we've been able to accomplish to the tune of almost 2/3 is because of the partnership with the United States Congress. Started out as an earmark 20 years ago. It's been reauthorized a number of times. The present authorization has three things that are different. One, it's longer, goes to 10 through 2028, and that is to coordinate more or less with the, I was going to say semi-quincentennial, but I'll say the 250th commemoration. Second, it's more money. The Congress, 5 years ago when they reauthorized this again, added the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, but they didn't add any more money or authorization for more. This does that. And the third thing it does, very importantly, provides part of the money authorized to be for education and interpretation. These are outdoor classrooms. The better they're interpreted and restored, the more effective they are in teaching civics. We obviously support that. We're very grateful for what this committee has done for us in the past, and we look forward, hopefully, to the passage of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lighthizer, and thank you all for your valuable testimony. Now we'll move on to member questions, and I'd like to recognize Mr. Neguse first.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again, thank you for holding this important hearing. And thank you, Ms. Lehman, for your wonderful testimony and for your work with the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, and for your support and the Commission's support of H.R. 473 in the Every Word We Utter statute. I just had two questions. First, I'm wondering if you could kind of share with us the historical significance of the preferred placement for the statue here in Washington, D.C., and perhaps in what ways you believe the site would make the statue more accessible to folks here in the city and across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the way that the legislation is written, it's been proposed that this statue be placed somewhere in between the Supreme Court, where it stands now, and the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. So the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument was created as a national monument in 2016, but it has been the headquarters of the National Woman's Party since 1929. Before the National Woman's Party moved to the Belmont Paul House, where it stands now, our headquarters was actually where the Supreme Court is today. So we moved from that spot where the Supreme Court was over to where the Belmont Paul sits now. So that location right there on the hill, the suffrage movement, the women's equality movement has existed there in the heart of the hill for 100 years. I can think of no better place to place this statue so that people who are traveling that trail of women's history around Washington, D.C. can have access to this statue. The Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, it's only open from 9 to 5 on certain days of the week. right? But this statue will be accessible to the public, to children, to young girls, to be able to see, to experience, to witness. You can walk all the way around it, no matter which part of the statue you're standing on. It tells a story, and it will be there to tell this public history of this movement for women's equality in a way that has never been told before. And that is so powerful and so important. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Lehman. Also, perhaps my final point, I think you mentioned it in your testimony, I certainly mentioned it in mine, but I think it's worth again stating for the record that it's your understanding there is no other outdoor statue in honor of the suffrage movement here in our nation's capital.
That's exactly right, yeah. So there is the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, but other than that, no. So part of the work of the commission over the next year is to make sure that governments, local communities, municipalities are doing everything that they can to lift up this history, because women's history just doesn't get told and it doesn't get taught. And so we have a huge challenge in front of us, not just to tell the story of women's suffrage and the fight for the ballot, but to change the way that we teach and approach American history in this country. So it's a pretty big mission. We're going to do it in the next year. But your question speaks to the challenges that we face, right? There is no other monument in Washington, D.C. right now dedicated to this history. And of the monuments that we do have, very few are dedicated to women's history. This is so crucial and so important that in this moment, this centennial, that we do what we can to make sure that these women are recognized so that for the next 100 years, this history is taught and remembered and told.
Well, again, thank you, Ms. Lehman, and I really appreciate your testimony. Again, appreciate the work of the commission, and am hopeful that our colleagues here will support this important bill, a way to really honor the suffrage movement here in our nation's capital. Is long overdue, and of course, as a member of the Colorado delegation, to be able to honor the work done by our wonderful sculptor who's joined us today from the great city of Loveland, which is in my district. So I think it just across the board is a great proposal, and I want to thank my colleagues in Colorado for co-sponsoring it, as well as in particular with respect to this committee, my colleague Representative Lamborn. So with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Neguse. The chair now recognizes Mr. Heiss for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I appreciate you again holding this hearing today, and I thank the ranking member as well for allowing me to break in the line a little bit. It's been a great honor for me the last couple of Congresses to introduce the Preserving America's Battlefield Act, and Mr. Lighthouser, I want to thank you for your support, and the American Battlefield Trust has been just invaluable, and I deeply appreciate your involvement with that. Also like to thank my friend from Virginia, Mr. McEachin, who stepped in for Madam Chair earlier, for his great support with this as well. And I appreciate you mentioning the staff. There's no question the staff has done a phenomenal job and step in many ways that we simply cannot be there. And so thank you for your recognition and shout out to them. I think most people here are aware of the American Battlefield Protection Program. It's authorized in 1996, really to do just as you said, to promote and protect our battlefields, many of which are being lost in time right now. And for us to be able in this committee and in this Congress to step up to the plate and try to preserve those significant parts of our past is extremely important for us to be able to do. Particularly this bill, as you mentioned, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. I think it's stunning for people to look into this and discover just how many of these battlefields are disappearing right under our nose. And the fact that the trust has been involved to prevent that from disappearing in our history is significant. I believe you mentioned some 50,000 acres, 24 states. And, you know, that's a huge stepped forward, and I know 180 acres in my own state, my own district of Kettle Creek has been preserved a couple of years ago. And I mean, this is the only major patriot victory in the state of Georgia during the Revolutionary War, and it's important to us and important to our nation to preserve this. In short, the bill basically sets the authorization for federal matching grants to $20 million, and included in that is $2 million a year for restoration and interpretation. It's great that we preserve them, but that we also continue to have the education and the interpretation why they're so important. I love the way you describe these as outdoor classrooms. This program has been extremely successful. It has had bipartisan support. Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama both were strong supporters of this, and both in authorization and reauthorization. Right now we have nearly 60 co-sponsors, pretty much evenly divided right down the middle between both parties, and I'm very appreciative of that and for everyone who's been involved. So just with the brief time I have, Mr. Heiser, could you just provide us with a memorable example of how this program has been used to save a battlefield that probably would have been lost, and then how the funds for the education might be used to enhance the experience for visitors?
Sure. First, let me commend you for your good work at Kettle Creek. We didn't win a whole lot down that part of the world, but we won that one. So my compliments. Just very briefly, I'll give you two examples. One is Princeton. A couple years ago, the bulldozers were literally out on a piece of ground about 15 acres. I mean, literally they were scraping it, destroying it. And it was where George Washington led the countercharge in the first time the Americans beat the regular British Army. It's a huge point of American history. Some of the first Marines fatalities were on that ground. It ended up being a $4 million transaction for 15 acres, but about $500,000 came from this program, and we couldn't have done it without it. The other one is Slaughter Pen Farm, Civil War, Battle of Fredericksburg. 208 acres, $12 million. It's the largest private sector battlefield transaction in American history. $2 million came from this program. Once again, we couldn't have done it without it. This program has been efficient, and it's been incredibly effective in saving our heritage. And it's been a wonderful partnership between the private sector, the citizens of this country, and the Congress. Those are two examples. The teaching and interpretation is crucial, because like you say, it's not good enough to just buy it. You've got to do something with it. You've got to restore it to what it looked like approximately, and then you got to tell the story. It's got to sing. It's got to say something.
Thank you so much, and Madam Chair, thank you. It's a huge bang for the buck, and with this matching grant, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Heiss, and thank you, Mr. Heiser. The chair recognizes Ranking Member Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Lehman, you said history should be taught, remembered, and told, and I think that would apply to all five of you here today. And I thank you for coming with your mission. You are all great advocates for your causes, and I appreciate all of your remarks. I would like to share with you just briefly what my home state of Utah is doing to that end. We will be replacing one of our two statues in the Capitol next year with Martha Hughes Cannon. And if you don't know the story of Martha Hughes Cannon, it's worth sharing with everybody again. She was the first woman state senator in the United States, and we're very proud that that's from Utah. Interestingly, she won that office by defeating my wife's great-grandfather, who happened to be Martha Hughes Cannon's husband. And makes the story a little bit more intriguing that she defeated her husband for that office. And we're looking forward as a state to that statue coming out here next year and being part of your celebration. Along those lines, General Ram, thank you for your thoughts. I'm wondering if you could help us articulate, much the way that Mr. Lighthizer has done, in a message that we could take back to our constituents about why we're recognizing what is different in the lives of those constituents in Utah because these men and women served, and I'm wondering if you could maybe give me something that I could take back.
To the best of my knowledge, we're the only division in the Army that engraves names on our monument of the fallen. It gives closure to those of us which are alive. If you ever see the families or the survivors of these fights, go to that monument and read those names. It gives them closure, and it allows America never to forget the price at which it enjoys freedom today, because there's a price for all that. When you go to our monument and you walk around and you look at all these names, they're real people. And I think it gives, in my case, as an example, I am alive today. But when I go to the Vietnam Wall, the first time I went, it gave me closure with that war. I am at peace with what we did. I'm happy with what we did. I'm satisfied with what we accomplished. But it did give me closure by going to the wall and remembering those that fell in service to their nation. I hope that's a short answer to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And on behalf of myself and my constituents, thank you personally for your service and to the many men and women that you represent. And with that, Madam Chairman, I yield my time.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. And I will recognize myself for 5 minutes or less, seemingly. Ms. Lehman, thank you for your testimony. It was very moving, and I'm anxious to see the actual monument, and grateful. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention here today, I appreciate the fact that the monument will include African American women, because it seems that in the the women's right to vote didn't apply to all women when it was passed. In fact, in my state of New Mexico, Native Americans couldn't vote until 1948. They weren't recognized as citizens of this country until 1924. It seemingly, and we heard this testimony earlier also, that the way that our government essentially kept different groups of people from participating in the American experience was to deem them either non-citizens or non-humans. So I feel like this goes a long way in helping us to rectify our history and make sure that we're telling the true history, and hoping that along those lines that we can remember the Native American women who weren't allowed to vote until much later in the century. So I appreciate that very much. As we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the House's passage of the 19th Amendment, why is it important that a monument commemorating women's suffrage provides an inclusive representation of all the women who fought for gender equality and our right to vote? And I'll add, who actually built this country.
Yes.
So in your words.
That's such an important question, and I wish I had more than 3 minutes. I could sit here all day and talk about this. Like you just said, the story of women's fight for the vote and women's fight for equality, it did not end in 1920. For women of color in particular, that fight continued for decades and decades. Asian American women, Native American women, and African American women each faced separate and distinct hurdles to the ballot that took until the 60s to be rectified and fixed, and for full voting rights to be established for all women in this country. So we absolutely see the 19th Amendment and this centennial as one chapter in the story of women's voting rights. It's not the end. And that is so, so, so important. One of the things that the commission is trying to urge as we meet with different legislators and different members of Congress is to ensure that everyone is going back to their states, back to their communities, and digging out those local stories. because it's not just Alice Paul, it's not just Ida B. Wells, it's not just Sojourner Truth or Carrie Chapman Catt or Lucretia Mott. There are so many women from Native American reservations up to upstate New York, from Oregon to Florida, who were crucial and a part of this movement. And women's history just doesn't get taught and told and remembered. So when history books are written and when teachers go into their classrooms, we learn about the Civil War, we learn about World War I, we learn about World War II, and we oftentimes forget to stop and ask, but wait, where were the women, right? Because they were there too. And they were working and they were fighting. And so we have to stop and we have to ask, where were the women? And we have to ask, where were the women of color? We have to ask both questions, and we have to make sure that we're answering both questions. And so I think with this monument that we are proposing here in this legislation, it's going to tell that full and complete story, and it's going to make sure that the story that we do tell is a diverse story, it's an inclusive story, and it's not a story that stops in 1920. It's a story that for many women in this country still continues today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Ms. Burgess, I don't have a lot of time left, but I just wanted to quickly ask, considering your testimony, in your opinion, how will designating the Fort Pillow battlefield as a unit of the National Park Service elevate and preserve the story of the African Americans garrisoned at Fort Pillow?
Fort Pillow is a sacred place. It's a testimony about the sacrifice, bravery, and heroism, and the audacity to fight for freedom. It needs to be uplifted to the American people. A lot of people don't know about it. Tennessee is challenged to present that history to the nation. And that's why I was asked to present Armstead's legacy regarding what happened to him. It's the fact that African American soldiers after Fort Pillow used Fort Pillow to really fight for freedom. It was a battle cry, remember Fort Pillow. The fact that we have not remembered it is really sad. It's about white soldiers who were Unionists. It was about black soldiers. It was about the men and women who were protecting this country, and that story needs to be told and to be educated. And the fact that school children can't even get to the fortification because it's a 2-mile round-trip hike to the fortification is sad. It needs proper stewardship, and hopefully, given the National Park Service endeavors regarding preserving the legacy of battlefields, this will have its truth and be realized.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. And I thank every single one of you, the witnesses, for your valuable testimony, and the members for your questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following this hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for the responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Yeah, thank
No, it's
you.
very good.
Yeah,
It's very good.
yeah,
It
thank
should not be
you.
forgotten.
Yep. My dad was a he was in the military, and we have a long legacy. Thank you. Thank you.
Good luck with that. I hope it happens for you.
Thank you.
That's
Thank
really,
you very much.
you did a nice job.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.